Last speaker is Sarah Glass, the Director for Special Projects at the U.S. Global Development Labs at the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Thank you all for having me here today. It's really fun to go last. Peter and Kirsten set really high expectations for what we're doing in the Global Development Lab at USAID, and I'll say we are tremendously excited about what we are doing there. As the Director of Special Projects in the U.S. Global Development Lab, have recently been leading a team, recently I say for the last 2 years, have been leading a cross-functional team within USAID focused on bringing the best of the lab's capabilities in science, technology, innovation, and public-private partnerships to the agency's Ebola response and recovery work. And I'll say I was recently giving a presentation and someone said, can you talk about something other than Ebola? We are really tired of talking about Ebola. It feels like we constantly talk about Ebola. And the answer to that is I could. And at the same time, so many of us in the global community focused on health have spent so much time over the last 2 years focused on the Ebola epidemic and Ebola recovery that I think it is critical that we continue to talk about it because there's so many learnings there and there's so much to mine. So I'll talk today a little bit about Ebola and largely about experiences that I think are cross-cutting across our global health issues. I wanted to start by telling a story. I was in Conakry in 2015, and I spent the day with 3 Ghanaian young men who were contact tracers in Conakry. So I spent the day going from, actually just outside of Conakry. And so I spent the day going from house to house with these young men who were basically checking up on each Ebola potential suspected case or families who had come in contact with cases of Ebola to understand, take their temperature, understand if they were showing symptoms, and also check in to see if they had the supplies that they needed, largely food and water, in order to be able to stay in quarantine in their households. And one of the reasons I was on this site visit with these contact tracers was to see how they were using a tool called ComCare, which was a phone app made by Demagi, to record their contact tracing visits. And I was with a couple of folks, some of my colleagues from USAID, who were really skeptics about the use of this digital tool in contact tracing. And in talking to the contact tracers, they were also carrying a pretty heavy stack of paper forms that they were creating in duplicate. So they would enter the contact tracing information in their smartphone app, and then they would also at the same time write all the information down on the paper form. And in talking to them, I understood a little bit that the paper forms were required by the government of Guinea. And so there was no choice. They had to use this paper form. Their district was piloting the use of the cell phone app. And some of my colleagues said, we're not sure that we believe that the cell phone app makes sense. It's duplication of effort. What happens if the cell phone breaks? What do you do? And the response from the contact tracers was, today we have lots of paper forms, but actually, the cell phone is great. We have no problems with it. Usually, we run out of paper. And this was just one of these moments where it was sort of like, okay. And I think as I was thinking about what I wanted to share with you today, there were 3 things that I felt like I wanted you to take away from my experiences in the lab. And one was that you asked about innovation and technology in global health. And innovation and technology are not the same thing. And they are both fundamentally about behavior change. And behavior change that sticks takes time. The second point is that both technology and innovation have tremendous potential to bring efficiencies to our work and to accelerate impact. However, in the design stages, they require engagement of more staff with diverse skill sets, not fewer staff. And then the third point was that to be successful in both innovation and technology, we must break down silos across our work. And that is across disease categories where we're motivated based on funding that is siloed by disease states, but also across development sectors and types of expertise. So if you think about the story that I just told you, that it really does showcase how technology is behavior change, right? The innovation there was not the tool, but the process of helping the government adapt and become comfortable with the tool. And one of the things that we saw in that case was later in the day, I sat with the district health manager, and I understood how he was using the tool. And he really proudly pulled up his laptop and explained that he started his day every day by looking at his dashboard of his contact tracers. And he said that in looking at the dashboard, he could see, because they were geolocated, he could see whether the contact tracers had actually been to people's houses or whether they had sat at home and just filled out the forms based on the information that they created in their heads, which I think was some concern in holding them accountable. When you have an incentive to have 100% reporting, sometimes incentive to have 100% reporting leads to a lot of false information. But he said, I can see, because this is geolocated, even if it's not connected to the internet, it geotags, and then I can see if they actually went there, and I can follow up. And it was, that conversation that I could see that, one of the reasons the contact tracers liked the tool and that he liked the tool was they had created a feedback loop of how they were using the tool. If he didn't see the contact tracers in the dashboard, then they were going to hear from him in terms of why they hadn't been to those homes and what was happening. Similarly, you heard from Kirsten the example where there were feedback loops. We so often integrate technology into health programs in a way that we ask for information, but we don't give anything back. And seeing behavior change doesn't happen without those kinds of feedback loops. I have said that adoption of technology and innovation takes time, and it does, but I think it's important to pause here and note that there are quick wins, and we need to adopt them. And so an example is that the forms that were being used by the government of Guinea in contact tracing were not machine-readable forms. And so that meant that someone was manually transcribing everything on those forms into a database. And it's not just the lost time and labor of that, but the error that you have in the data when you have manual transcription is huge. And so I think it's really important that we look for those kinds of quick wins that are readily adoptable. I want to speak a little bit to my point around technology leading not to fewer people, but to the need for more people. You can imagine that at USAID now, when we review a digital health proposal, you need not only a public health expert, but also a technologist. And your technologist and your public health expert are not the same. And we've got a team, a very small team in the Global Development Lab focused on real-time data and technology. And that team is so oversubscribed in terms of the demand that we get from around the agency to provide consultation and support. We really do need to see the skill sets of the development industry changing to have technologists as a critical expertise that we are bringing to the table in designing our development programs. And I'll say it's not just software developers and folks who can review code and understand the code. It's important to then think about people who can analyze the information and help make decisions based on the information too. So it's not just one type of expertise, but it is several types of expertise. Something that I frequently talk to USAID missions about is they ask for, we think we're ready to hire somebody who can advise us on technology. Can we hire an information communications technology advisor? And we'll say back to them, absolutely, tell us about what you want to do. And they lay out, well, we want to have better data analysis across all of our different development sectors, and we want to focus on digital financial inclusion and e-payments, and we also want to look at communications and connectivity infrastructure. And right there, you've just described 3 very different skill sets that they want to fill with one person. And that's a really, really hard thing to do. And so just understanding how our workforce needs to shift in order to accommodate these skills, I think is something that's really very important. Moving to my third point around shifting away from silos. I'm hesitant to share this statistic because I have nothing to back it up. So don't write it down. Just take it as anecdotal. But I had a conversation with a colleague 2 weeks ago who quoted me a statistic that USAID implementing partners spend up to, or on average, of 20 to 25% of their budgets on technology and information systems. Now, we should actually know what the answer to that is, and I don't know, so I'm not quoting you that specific statistic. But I am saying that I believe that our implementing partners spend a lot of their funding on technology and information systems. And there is not only some degree of waste and duplication in that, right? There is surely overlapping investments there. But there's also tremendous opportunity to see those technology investments come together and interoperate in a way that, to pick up on what Ed was saying, certainly there is a role for standards in this space, but standards are never going to be the only thing that helps us bring those components of technology together. You're always going to have some degree of customization that needs to fall outside the standards. Related to standards, one of the things that USAID and a number of other development actors have done is created a set of principles for digital development that is cross-cutting across sectors. And that's a set of principles that will need to live and continue to be adapted, just as technology continues to evolve and be adapted. And that's a really valuable sort of guiding tool. But at the same time, standards are not going to cut it. We also have to have a way to bring our partners together to proactively incentivize partners to create that interoperability and integration between their systems, particularly as it relates to health information systems, so that we are seeing the true and best data picture that we can see in making decisions. Related to breaking down silos, it's not just in specific health investments, but I think it's really important to acknowledge the role that we can play in, or that infrastructure, to the point of Kirsten's map, has to play in strengthening health systems. And that infrastructure is certainly digital infrastructure. It's also roads. It's also electricity. This is an area where I think we find our teams really, really struggling to say, you know what, I can't achieve health system strengthening and health outcomes here if I can't get patients down a road to a clinic, and if I can't find out whether or not a clinic has the medicines that they need, because I can't communicate with the clinic because they don't have any cell phone access. Et cetera. And so I think we've got to get a lot more creative about how we de-silo our funding to support infrastructure that is targeted at strengthening health systems in the health space. And, you know, I just want to debunk a little bit of a myth that I always hear on this, which is when you're talking about digital infrastructure, it used to be that you said, you know what, you can't invest in digital infrastructure before you invest in power and electricity. Because if you've invested in digital infrastructure and not invested in power and electricity, then how do you power your digital devices? And I was talking with a colleague the other day who works in the energy space, and she said, you know what, we've now seen things shift significantly to where if you invest in the digital infrastructure so that someone can have communications access with a cell phone, all of a sudden that unlocks market opportunities for them, and it unlocks digital financial systems. And so then perhaps they can afford pay-as-you-go solar systems or off-grid systems. And so we've seen a little bit of a flip to see where early investments in digital infrastructure can help unlock other investments in infrastructure. And I think you know, we've certainly talked about how important that is specifically to disease surveillance and understanding just basic health operations and strengthening health systems in staying connected to health clinics that are in remote or rural areas. Wanting to be conscious of time, I just want to come back to. I've spent a lot of time talking about innovation here, and I want to or technology, and I want to turn to for a moment to innovation. Certainly, adoption of technology is behavior change, and adoption of innovation is also behavior change and takes time too. As an example, the Fighting Ebola Grand Challenge that we ran during the Ebola crisis truly generated a tremendous amount of energy and enthusiasm. So we had 1,500 concepts come in through that challenge. You can imagine that an average USAID procurement has sort of 10 applicants, right? And so the time and energy that it took to review those 1,500 applicants and then cull down to the best solutions really resulted in some exciting innovations, but it does take a huge amount of time. And then we also have to be patient about the time that it takes to test and adapt and develop those innovations. I think there was an expectation, for example, that when we developed a new personal protective equipment suit, that could hit the ETUs or the Ebola treatment units immediately. And certainly you wouldn't want to be a healthcare worker in an Ebola treatment unit wearing a brand new PPE suit that hadn't been tested. And so, we've got to capture the moment where the world is focused on how to develop solutions and can really come together with the idea that we can't immediately deploy something, even if we're doing it on a very accelerated timescale, but that we will have it the next time around. I also want to say that in breaking down silos, it's really important to create the right dedicated space for innovation. And that dedicated space includes connection between users and local innovators and diverse types of outside talent and expertise, and an appetite for and a comfort with failure. And that's hard in the U.S. government, but you have to expect it. And you have to give people credit for doing it well. And I think that that's a nut that we haven't yet cracked, is to really encourage our partners to step forward with their failures, own them quickly, and figure out how, there's a difference between failing quickly and failing well and really learning from those things, and taking quite a long time because you're continuing to try to salvage something that doesn't cut it. And so I think we've got to figure out the right incentives to encourage good failure. And then, following up on what Peter said earlier, where he focused on sort of sourcing widely and scaling selectively, we have to focus on and fund evidence over time. That when we are looking to source and scale innovations, we have to be laser focused on evidence. I want to close with something that is unrelated to my 3 points, but was in your questions, which is as we look ahead to the trends of the future, we should expect particularly technology and so many of the spaces that we work in to continue to evolve rapidly. And I think that means that we have to plan for today and tomorrow. And the example that I'll give here is that our team has been very, very focused on mHealth solutions using the basic phones that people have in their pockets today, and that our healthcare workers have in their pockets today. And that is critical because that's, as Ed said, that's what people have. I recently traveled to a school outside Monrovia in Liberia, and a group of teenage boys asked to take a selfie with me. And I realized that they were all holding smartphones. And this was not a wealthy school in any way. I asked them how old they were, and they were between the ages of 12 and 15. And every one of them had a smartphone. Now, they didn't have a data plan, and they were using it in a specific way. But I think it's really important that as we're designing, for example, a 5-year program, that we think about the idea that today we have to design for a basic phone, but there's a 15-year-old who's going to be in the workforce at some point in the next 5 years who has a smartphone and who's used to using it. And so we have to be prepared to adapt and evolve in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much.